Thank you so much, Gary, and welcome to the Time Warner Center and yet another forum conversation. There are only a handful of people around the world who truly need no introduction. Their names and faces are immediately recognizable, their achievements even more so. President Bill Clinton is one of those rare few. So here goes, the introduction for a man you already know. Remember the Clinton presidency? Nearly 12 years later, and it feels like another lifetime, or maybe just a time when America was not at war anywhere. During the Clinton administration, home mortgage foreclosures were not a national epidemic. Bailouts were not synonymous with banks. And no one spoke of deficit reduction or fiscal austerity because during the last 3 years of the Clinton presidency, America operated with a budget surplus. Those were the days when America didn't just print money, it had money. Clinton presided over the longest sustained period of peacetime economic expansion in American history. The stock market soared and the unemployment rate sank with the creation of 22 million new jobs. Here's another shocker. When Bill Clinton was president, Democrats and Republicans worked together rather than sabotaged one another. Both houses of Congress actually passed bipartisan legislation. We know this to be true because House Speaker Newt Gingrich reminds us daily of how well he and President Clinton got along. When he left office, President Clinton's approval rating was at the highest of any president since World War II, and he remains immensely popular even today. There's no formula for ex-presidents and how they spend their post-presidential days. Some write books, others decorate their presidential libraries, some work on their ranches, some try to maintain a public life, and others fade away. President Clinton never took a step back after his presidency. Oddly enough, in some ways, he has become even more relevant as a crusading diplomat on the world stage. His Clinton Foundation is taking on some of the world's great challenges, from climate change to public health to economic development and the alleviation of poverty. He has participated in rescue, relief, and recovery efforts on behalf of captured journalists in North Korea, the victims of the tsunami in South Asia, the earthquake in Haiti, and of course, Hurricane Katrina. He is a true global goodwill ambassador, but today he is our conversation guest at the forum. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome President Bill Clinton.
Thank you. So this is a question and answer session, and I'm not supposed to give a speech. But I would be remiss if I didn't thank Time Warner and my great friend Gary Ginsberg for 20 years ago coming to work for me. He did think he'd be home in the springtime. I was running 5th in New Hampshire when he came to work for me. And I thank Paul Washington and everybody that made these facilities possible. I also want to thank Fordham Law School for, among other things, 2 of the most important members of my post-presidential office. Greg Milner, he's a graduate of Fordham Law School and is the deputy chief of staff of my office in Harlem, and spends almost all his time on Haiti in the unbelievable effort we're making there. And Justin Cooper is a graduate of Fordham Law School, although I have tried without success to document his attendance record there. But he actually wrote all 3 of the books I've written since I left the White House with me. That is, we wrote them together. I'd write them out in hand because, believe it or not, I thought I was making fewer mistakes, and then he would put them into the computer, and then we'd rewrite them 6 times, and he did all the fact checking. So most of what I've put in print would not have been possible without him. So I think I'm deeply indebted to Fordham, which is the main reason I agreed to do this. Thank you for inviting me.
It's nice to hear. Thank you, Mr.
And besides, I used to teach in law school, and I miss it. So here I am. We're going back to the Socratic method.
Well, it's funny, you gave me this tremendous lead-in because your story is actually quite familiar. You were a Rhodes Scholar, and then you went to Yale Law School, and then you worked on the McGovern presidential campaign of 1972. And then you went off and began teaching law school at University of Arkansas, where you taught, if I remember, antitrust and agency law initially. But then here's something that's interesting. Within a very short time, I think less than a year, you declared that you were going to run for Congress. So one question I have, since you opened this up for us, was it because public service called and the opportunity to live in public life was what beckoned? Or did you just realize that being a law professor was mindless, silly, irrelevant as a profession, and that you thought, you could do better? And don't worry, because there aren't any law professors in sight here. Say what you...
No, actually, I loved it. I love being a teacher. I taught antitrust, agency and partnership, criminal law, criminal procedure, admiralty, and constitutional law. And one of the reasons that the rest of the faculty liked me is that I was the new guy on the block. I didn't have tenure. They figured I'd never hang around long enough to get it. So they made me teach everything they didn't want to teach. And I was the only guy. We had to offer admiralty because there were lakes in Arkansas which are part of rivers that in their original condition had been navigable, therefore they were within the admiralty jurisdiction. And I was the only person on the faculty that ever even had an admiralty course. But the year I ran for president, a guy shows up in my campaign headquarters in New Hampshire and became a full-time volunteer. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about 1973 when I started, back in the dark ages. And he said, I'm here because in my very first year as a lawyer, I made a $100,000 fee in an admiralty case, which I could only take because I took your course. And I am here to pay you back 19 years later. No, I loved it. But what happened was 1974, it was the Watergate year. We had a congressman who was very close to President Nixon and maintained until 3 days before he resigned that he was innocent of any wrongdoing. And because of a lot of the details of our district, and because the guy had a fabulous casework operation, he had an 85% approval rating. So I went to 6 other people. I was like Demosthenes in Athens looking for an honest man, begging them to run for Congress. I saw one of them just a couple of days ago in Arkansas, and none of them would do it. So I talked to the dean, and he had a meeting with the appropriate faculty committee, and they said, oh, what the heck, do it if you want. I didn't even take any time off till almost the end of the primary because I just worked it around what I was doing. And then I did take a term off to run in the general election, and I lost, but he had 85% approval rating when I started and 99% name recognition. I had 0-0. On election day, he got 51.5% of the vote. I got 48.5%. I'd taken his approval rating from 85 to 69 and mine from 0 to 66, and that's exactly the margin by which I lost. It's the best campaign and the best preparation for the rest of my life I could have had. And it probably made me a better law teacher because I learned more about storytelling.
I also remember in reading your book, My Life, which I'm sure you've all read. It is just absolutely stupendous. As far as I'm concerned, that and the autobiography of Ulysses S. Grant are the 2 greatest of the presidential biographies, and they didn't know each other. But I did remember reading in your book that the law students ended up driving you. You had a lot of good drivers out of them. They actually
I got a lot of drivers out of my law school.
So let's just take your life as to where we are now, your post-presidential days. I mean, you had an opportunity when you left the White House to become a gentleman farmer in Chappaqua. That was a chance. You could have done it. You could have done that if you...
You actually can do that in Westchester County. If you earn $10,000 a year from your agricultural operation, you get a huge break on your property tax,
But instead...
which are the highest in America in Westchester County.
But instead, you created all of these incredible moving parts. There's the Clinton Foundation, and there's many pieces to that, and maybe we'll talk a little about the Global Initiative, which seems to be an incredible all-star team each year assembles under your program with artists and Nobel Prize winners to discuss the world problems. There's a whole public health dimension as well that deals with HIV/AIDS. And then we know of your incredible recovery and relief work, and recently you've been named a special UN advisor, envoy to Haiti. You've been busy, so tell us a little about these various pieces. There's also the climate change that we get out of the Clinton Foundation. So take us through this so we'll understand where your efforts have been.
Well, essentially, when I left the White House, I had two ideas. One is that I wanted to be active in areas that I had cared very much about when I was president, where I could still have an impact. There are lots of things I cared about when I was president that I still care about, but I don't have any direct impact anymore and can't through an NGO. The second thing I wanted to do was to try to build up what I said in the 90s. I said now that the Cold War is over, we live in an interdependent world, and there's going to be this pitched battle for the next Humpty Dump decades between the forces that are bringing us together and the forces that are tearing us apart. And now I basically, the words I use are somewhat different, which is that the job of citizenship in the 21st century is to build up the positive forces of our interdependence, like cooperative scientific research, cooperative economic advances, and to reduce the negative forces of interdependence, which essentially are inequality, instability, and unsustainability. And so I set out to do that. And then I just kind of fell into some of the things we did. I set up a school in Arkansas of public service that is the only graduate program in the country you can get a degree in public service, not public policy, and half the time people spend in the field actually doing projects. And it's interesting, I've been contacted by academic programs all over the country, all over the world, asking for more information about how we build the service component. And then I started this AIDS program because Nelson Mandela and I were going around the world rattling the tin cup trying to raise money for AIDS before the Global Fund on AIDS, TB, and Malaria was established, before PEPFAR, the President Bush's program, was passed. There was no money for this. And since the money, there were only 200,000 people in 2002, only 200,000 people in poor countries and rising countries in the entire world getting AIDS medicine, and 2/3 of them were in Brazil, which had its own pharmaceutical industry. And a lot of the others were in Thailand, which had its own pharmaceutical industry. So people were just dying alone out there. And we basically devised a new model where we lowered the price of AIDS medicine with companies that we promised would not lose profits by doing it, because I was able to guarantee them vast new volumes of sale and prompt payment. And out of that grew a whole new approach of trying to find a way to be profit-oriented in a positive way. So we built this huge AIDS operation. We expanded it to tuberculosis, then to malaria, then to building healthcare systems, and we got 1,000 people around the world just working on healthcare systems. And then we started in climate change. And then after my heart surgery, I devised this Alliance for a Healthier Generation with the American Heart Association, where we're trying to turn the tide against childhood obesity and the breathtaking rise of diabetes among young people in America. It's my biggest project here. Then we have specific economic projects in the U.S., in Latin America, and in Africa. And then starting with the Gujarat earthquake in 2001, and the effort we made, Bob Dole and I did, to raise money to guarantee scholarships for the children and spouses of all the people killed or disabled on 9/11. I've just kind of developed a whole separate, if I were a lawyer, I'd say I've got a disaster practice over here. And so I worked with first President Bush in the tsunami area, and then we did Katrina together, and then I worked with the second President Bush in Haiti, and I wound up with a new UN job after the tsunami and after the Haiti earthquake. So that's basically what I do. But every one of those things is something where I think I'm building up the positive and reducing the negative forces of interdependence. The Clinton Global Initiative is separate from all that. It is basically our attempt to provide a network of creative problem solvers with business people, political leaders, philanthropists, heads of NGOs, including people from some of the poorest countries in the world. We fly in every year, and everybody makes a commitment to do something to make a difference, and then we keep score and we help them make the commitment, we help them implement the commitment. But my basic premise is that what works in the modern world is creative networks of cooperation. And one of the reasons we're in the fix we're in is what really works in modern politics is conflict carried on at a highly abstract, rhetorical, fact-free level designed to short-circuit your brain and substitute your emotions. And somehow we have to, those of us who are in the former camp need to find out how to tap into people's emotions better, but people who really give a rip whether America comes back and does right by the rest of the world have to find a way to make our politics look more like the decision-making process that works in the real world. You look at all the prosperity centers in America, they're creative networks of cooperation. And it would be boring to see them on the evening news because we want to see somebody calling somebody else a name and hitting them upside the head with a 2x4. But it doesn't make many good things happen. Otherwise, I don't have strong feelings about that.
Your relief work now with Haiti in particular is interesting, and your special UN envoy relationship. I can't help but remembering that in your memoir, Haiti is where you and Secretary of State Clinton had your honeymoon. And one thing that in reading your memoir, it comes up time and time and again is you're loyal to your places. You go back. The places that you traveled through when you were a student at Oxford, you went back. You took Secretary of State Clinton. And then you went back again when you were president. And it is sort of an interesting coincidence, or maybe it's just who you are, the way you're wired, that not only have you been involved in this sort of disaster practice, as you say, but that Haiti would receive such special attention. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Part of it is the way I was raised. I mean, when I was a governor, once a month I had lunch with my next door neighbor in high school, the girl I took to the senior prom and her husband, my next door neighbor in junior high school, my best friend in junior high school. We had lunch together. When I was president, every time I came back to Arkansas, if we had to wait till nearly midnight to start, all those people would come to me and we would play cards and talk about our kids and our lives. After I left office, I try to see them every time I go home. I was raised that way. I think that, look, there's still places I haven't been. I've never been to Mongolia. I want to ride a horse and where Genghis Khan rode. I want to climb Kilimanjaro before the snows melt. There are lots of things I want to do, but I think it's good to try to hold your life together. And your old friends will like you whether you become president or you're running a service station or something in between. That's always meant a lot to me. And I do love Haiti. And besides that, the darndest things happen. I mean, if you read my autobiography, I talk about how Hillary and I spent an afternoon in 1975 at a voodoo camp center. And we were the guest of a man named Max Beauvoir, who was the voodoo priest. But he was a very unusual voodoo priest. He had a degree from NYU and one from the Sorbonne. And he went to Paris and married a beautiful French wife and had 2 beautiful coffee-colored daughters and made millions of dollars in a chemical business he built himself. And his grandfather, on his deathbed, summoned him home and said, Max, it's you, there's no one else to succeed in, because he realized that there was no government in Haiti at the time outside of Port-au-Prince, no justice system, no social service system. Without thinking, he told his wife, and she said, okay, and they sold their business, cashed out, and moved to Haiti. Many years later, a Harvard biochemist named Wade Davis wrote an amazing book called The Serpent and the Rainbow about the zombie phenomenon and the biochemical basis of it. Davis did a lot of his research by going first to Max Beauvoir and having his daughter, who then was a student at Radcliffe, take him around and show him. Today, 79-year-old Max Beauvoir is the chief priest of voodoo in Haiti. Or as the previous president said, he's the Pope of voodoo. Now, what are the odds that some kid that spent a day with him in 1975 would become president and then become the co-chairman of the Reconstruction while he is the head of all the voodoo practitioners in Haiti and my wife is the Secretary of State? Long odds. There's something to be said. No, all I'm saying is there's something to be said for staying up with your roots. The people that started out with you will be with you. They'll be with you if you make a fool of yourself. They'll be with you when you make mistakes. And President Johnson once said, they asked him why he went home to Johnson City, Texas, after he lived all over the country and had all this power and had the money to live anywhere he wanted. He said, I went home because it's a place where people know when you're sick and care when you die. One of those people I told you that I always see is deathly ill, and we all care. That's a pretty important thing. You give up your roots, there's a price to giving up your roots and a value to holding on to them.
Speaking of the Secretary of State, she recently announced that she's going to be stepping down at the end of the first term of the Obama administration, and I'm wondering whether there are any plans for her to join the Clinton Foundation in your crusading work around the world, and if so, would she need to submit a resume and a letter of recommendation from the president? And I ask you this because in the memoir, one thing stood out, I think, not just that you go back to roots, but you wrote so lovingly and admiringly of Hillary Rodham and how you met her and how brilliant she was and what a capacious mind she was and how incredibly politically, how much skill she had and insight and intuition. And
well, the first time I asked her to marry me, I said in the next breath, I want you to marry me, but you shouldn't do it. And she said, why? I said, because I got to go home to Arkansas. It's my home. It's my life. I have to do this. And I have to try to get in politics, which was totally irrational. I had in all my family tree, I had one uncle who'd spent one term in the state legislature. And his wife made him quit because she hated politics. And I said, it's me. I won't be me. I'll just drive and go away if I don't do this. I got to go home. I owed law school debt. I had no money. I had no nothing. It was a fool's errand. The odds of it all working out were a zillion to one. And I said, you are the most talented person of our generation. And I already knew a lot of the people through the, the anti-Vietnam War movement and all these elections, a lot of people who later became famous, went to the Senate, became other people. I said, I know all these guys. You're better. You're the most able person I've ever known. You should go to Chicago, go home to Chicago, or move to New York or something and run for office. And she laughed at me, and she sounded like all those press people painting a caricature of her 30 years later. She said, oh, God, I'm just a bossy broad, so nobody's ever going to vote for me for anything. I can be perfectly happy serving in other ways. So she came home, the rest is history. I did feel that. And if she wants to join my foundation, it would make me ecstatic. But I think it's important to point out that this is just somewhere else, another example where she was a step ahead of me. When we started going together, she was on the boards of NGOs when we were in law school. She started a legal aid.
Right.
She was one of the first legal aid lawyers at Yale Law School, providing legal aid services. When she came to Arkansas to live, she started legal aid services at the Arkansas Law School. When she moved to Little Rock, she started the Arkansas Advocates for Families and Children, which is an amazing and often nationally recognized NGO. She found a preschool program started in Israel with the interesting acronym HIPPY. This is like the early 80s now. Home Instruction Program for Preschool Youngsters. And the idea was to teach parents to be their children's first teacher. The Israelis developed it because they had all these kids coming in from non-Hebrew-speaking cultures into Israel. And the woman who developed it was named Avima Lombard. So one day Hillary's talking to me about this, and I said, gosh, that sounds great. She said, we're going to have one in Arkansas. I said, how? She said, I'll call this woman in Israel. She'll be here next week. We're going to set it up. Now there are HIPPY programs in 26 or 27 states. For many years, the headquarters of HIPPY was here in New York. And the woman who ran it was the daughter of the famous television Dr. Ruth Westheimer. And Dr. Ruth's daughter did a superb job. Now they moved the headquarters to Arkansas because it's still the biggest place in the country. Hillary is an NGO machine all by herself. And so she may think I'm a half a step slow for her, but if she wants to join what we're doing, I'd be ecstatic. She's good at this. She loves it. She believes in it. And she was doing it a long time before it ever occurred to me to do.
Let's talk a little about our current economic crisis. Economic growth, job creation, tax reform, cutting entitlements, whether it be Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. We have alternate plans for budget, for deficit reduction and fiscal austerity, whether it's Ryan, it's Simpson Bowles. You just recently wrote a really, really great and important book, Back to Work, in which you talked about your solutions to how you think we can get back to work. Can you share some of those ideas with us?
Well, very briefly, first of all, the point of the book was to argue first that the current debate, which produced the current majority in Congress, which is that the government would screw up a two-car parade and is the source of all evil, it works every now and then in an election, but it's the nuttiest debate in the world. If you look at all the successful countries in the world, they have both a strong economy and an effective government. Now, it may be different. You may have different cultural values and different political values and different social objectives, but you can't find a truly successful economic powerhouse that's got the kind of hamstrung, kneeled down, broken bone government that the Tea Party advocated in the 2010 elections. And increasingly, countries that are really successful, both wealthy and developing countries, have a vibrant non-governmental sector that fills the gap between what the private sector will produce and the government that can provide, and often is more innovative because they don't have to turn a profit every quarter and they don't have to be afraid of mistakes. And they often make a real difference. So that's the point of the book. If you look at where the United States is, I think the argument I make is that if you first accept the premise that you need a strong government and a strong private sector, and you look at where we are, you see that the problem of all countries, if they live long enough in a given system, and we're the longest lasting, consistently freely elected democracy in history. And we like to think of ourselves as forever young, and we are in some ways, but our system's pretty old. All systems get long in the tooth. And at some point, whether they're public or private sector, the people running them become more interested in holding on to present gains than putting aside some of it for future benefit, more interested in preserving their positions than advancing the purpose for which the institutions were established. And therefore, reform is called for. That's true here. But you can't have the right reform if ideology trumps evidence. Example, let's take Medicare reform. There's no question that the biggest problem with the budget is health care cost, because the baby boomers are retiring and health care costs have been going up at 3 times the rate of inflation. No doubt about that. The question is, what should we do about it? My problem with Congressman Ryan is that ideologically he has to say the government's bad and privatization is good. No evidence can be allowed to intervene. And while it's true that if you just privatized a bunch of Medicare, you could, in the short run, cut the government's deficit. Here's the problem with that argument. From 1970 to 2010, per capita healthcare expenses in America increased 400%, right? Medicare and Medicaid. During the same time period, per capita private health insurance costs increased 700%. So my problem with all these privatized Medicare crowd is they want to solve a budget problem by creating a situation where one of two things will happen. We'll either bankrupt all these seniors trying to pay even more expensive health care, or we will drastically cut their life expectancy and quality of life by making sure that they don't have 700% increases. So on Social Security, I think the Simpson-Bowles plan is actually pretty good on Social Security. And before you, if you're a Democrat and you think I'm a heretic, I urge you to read it, because poor seniors actually do better under Simpson-Bowles than they do today. But Simpson, it's not a very big problem, really. It's a demographic problem. We now, for 12 years, we've had a group of people in school, they should be getting out of high school now, who are bigger than the baby boom generation. As they move into the workforce, and we, the baby boomers, move on to our eternal reward, America will begin to right its demographic balance. But for somewhere around 25 years or so, we'll have a lot of people retired for the people who are working. But it's fixable. That's not a problem. What you should worry about is the long-term debt, which is largely being driven by healthcare costs. But the real responsible answer is to bring healthcare costs more in line with the overall rate of inflation, and to stop spending 50% more for healthcare than any other rich country in the world and getting less for it, which is mostly because of the way we finance it and charge for it. So I don't mind people saying we got to do something about Medicare, but the idea that the right thing to do is to privatize is crazy. And I'm really sorry that Governor Romney, to get nominated, had to forego what would have been one of his best arguments. Actually, that young aide of his had got in trouble for saying that he needed his campaign to be like Etch-a-Sketch, you know, you shake it up. That's pretty much what needs to happen. He forgot that sometimes the worst thing you can do in politics is tell the truth. But why do I say that? Because Massachusetts has expensive health care. It's the 7th most expensive health care in the country. Before Romney signed the bill with the dreaded individual mandate, it was the 2nd most expensive system in the country. In other words, in the time since he signed the bill, health inflation in Massachusetts has been considerably lower than overall health inflation in America because of the individual mandate, because everybody was covered, because they stopped cost shifting. And Massachusetts is better off than it was. But unfortunately, he can't claim credit for that, because in the Spanish Inquisition that was a Republican primary, if he had flunked that question, they'd said, you're out of here. But we need, look, I think there is room for a lot of the conservative liberal debates. I'm the most conservative person on the budget that's been in the White House in a month of Sundays. I still have this depression mentality from when I was a kid. But you can't live in an evidence-free zone here. So anyway, my first take is the Simpson-Bowles Commission plan, although I don't agree with all of it, is a good framework for dealing with the long-term debt. The most important thing that the Democrats who criticize it forget is they say we absolutely should not implement this until robust growth has come back to America, because you cannot balance the budget, as Paul Krugman points out 3 times a week in the New York Times. You cannot balance the budget with austerity if there is no private sector growth and private sector borrowing. If you do it, you get what's happening in Europe now, where revenues go down even more than spending is cut. And I think we should do the things I said in the book to try to free up the money in the banks and in the corporations. And I believe we should do what Kenneth Rogoff suggests to accelerate the resolution of the housing crisis, which is to write down all the mortgages, but leave the banks with an equity interest in the house by the amount they write it down, so that when the value of the house goes up again, they share the profit, and you can't claim you gave an unjust benefit to the homeowner who is now paying on a $400,000 mortgage instead of an $800,000 mortgage when the house is only worth $400,000. That's essentially what I think should be done.
The nature of public debate in the United States right now, are you concerned about its divisiveness, how polarizing it is? It's very confusing. You know, during your presidency, you worked with the Republicans, and certainly you and the first President George Bush seemed to be friends, right? I mean, it just what's the walkaway, right? The takeaway that, you know, during the political process, it's very difficult to do anything other than win elections, but actually, when the game is over, I mean, what is it that we can do to remedy the level of public debate in America?
Well, first of all, one of the things that I am trying to avoid as I move, gracefully or not, into my dotage is selective memory. In my first 2 years as president, according to Thomas Patterson, who's a great student of the presidency and the media, and I had a tough time because the media, the general political model was different, than they were still into the get the president mode. I had kept a higher percentage of my promises than any of the previous 5 presidents, and I'd made more. But most voters didn't know it, because anytime I tried to do something I didn't do, like health care, because I didn't have 60 votes for it. I'll say more about that in a minute. It was a big deal. But during this time, I had more, believe it or not, loyal support from the Democrats than Lyndon Johnson did for his civil rights agenda, but I had more uniform opposition from the Republicans. I got tickled when Newt Gingrich was bragging about how we balanced the budget together, when every Republican voted against my 93 economic plan, which reversed trickle-down economics, and that plan was responsible for well over 90% of the budget balancing. Only a tiny contribution was made by the Balanced Budget Act of 1996, but it is not convenient for the political narrative to look at the real arithmetic. Now, don't forget, these people were accusing me of running drugs out of a secret airport in western Arkansas, of allowing people to be strapped to railroad tracks and run over and then having their murders cover up. I mean, we've all forgotten this. And what happened? They shut the government down twice because I wouldn't agree to their budgets on Medicare, Medicaid, and education. And I vetoed their budgets. I called their bluff. And they shut the government down twice. And the American people stuck with me. They decided I was right. It was an action-forcing event. So then you start the 96 election, and we did an amazing amount in an election year. That could happen here too. If the Congress decides that the president is going to get reelected and they want to stay reelected instead of what they gave us in 2010 when they had a very different electorate, older, whiter, less diverse electorate. Because it's a presidential year, they might get a lot done. But so first I would say, when the people vote for polarization, they get it. And I actually felt sorry for a lot of those Tea Party freshmen in the House this year. You may find that hard to believe. But I did, because their approval rating went almost down to single digits. And folks, all they did was what they promised to do. They were very straightforward with you in the election in 2010. They said they were going to do it. So we Americans, if we don't like it, it means two things. Either it sounded better in theory than it looks in practice, or we didn't care enough to go and vote in the midterm elections. So I think that almost no matter what happens, there will be more bipartisan cooperation after this election. But you have to realize that the partisanship that the American people deplore is all committed by people they elected. You and your friends back home, those of you who are here in school and not from New York. So we all need to kind of fess up here and take some responsibility for this and realize that we live in a time when conflict is good politics and cooperation is good policy. And somehow we need to make good policy and good politics a little more alike than they have been.
Mr. President, one last question. In December of 2010, President Obama seated at a White House press briefing, ceded the podium to you. He had just, at that time, concluded a bipartisan negotiation on the extension of the President Bush tax credits. And he was in the process of selling it to the American people, and you just happened to have been there, and he called you to the podium, and then there you were, for 30 minutes, holding court, the presidential seal in front of you.
So weird. It was weird.
You looked so presidential, you looked commander-in-chiefy, and you were amazing, and you explained this. In fact, you were so good, I don't know if anyone remembers this, President Obama went to a Christmas party. He just left you there. He figured you got it covered, President Clinton.
It wasn't exactly like that. I went to see him on another deal, and I had put out a statement in support of this compromise, which some people in our party had criticized. And so he said, I got to go answer questions about this. Will you come down and say you agree with me? And I said, sure. So we get up there, and I thought I was just going to say, amen. You know, hallelujah. And what I was being brought down to was to testify to the fact that I thought this was good economics. And I did. On balance, in order for the president to get his piece of the tax package, which was the payroll tax cuts, which all the economic analysis showed had the most direct positive impact on the economy, it was worth not letting the upper income tax cuts expire, not because I think mine should expire. I don't think I should have gotten any tax cuts from President Bush. But when there is no private sector growth, and when there is no demand for capital, and interest rates are zero, then public policy has to stimulate the economy. And so I really didn't want anything to be done right then to contract the economy, even raising my taxes, which I otherwise am wildly in favor of. So I was trying to help him. So we get there, and right as he goes up to speak, he comes back and says, oh, by the way, he says, now Michelle's expecting me at a party. And she'll be really mad if I'm late. So I'm going to answer 2 questions, and you're on your own. I said, Mr. President, you can't do it. I haven't been here in a long time. He says, it's just like riding a bicycle. It'll come back to you. That's what this private conversation is. Meanwhile, he says, just like riding a bicycle. And you need to explain to him that I did the right thing. Now, can I leave you? I said, okay. But it was weird. He hit me right between the eyes when we were standing there on the platform. So I did my best to defend it. I agreed with that. I think It was fun. And
But did you miss it? Was there a sense of, I don't want to give this podium back?
no, once in a great while in the last Humpty Dump year, I've been out of there a long time now. I've been out longer than I was in. Once in a while, I'll see something, some domestic or foreign policy thing, and I will think, that's something I wish I could do X right now, but not very often. I think it's, for all of you, you should remember this. I think it's a great waste of time to take an hour, much less a day, a week, a year of your life wishing you could do something you can't do anymore. Among the people I really admire are former professional athletes that make something out of their post-athletic career. I love Magic Johnson. I mean, just think of that. He had to walk away from basketball when he was still at the top because he was HIV positive. Everybody was scared to death he was going to bleed on him and start an epidemic. There was a lot of ignorance back then. And what a life he's built in the last 20 years. So I don't think about it much. And I love what I'm doing now. It's fun. Once in a while, I wish I had a different job. I wish I had been the Solicitor General in the healthcare case before the Supreme Court. Not because I don't think the one who was there did a right job, but I used to teach constitutional law, and I think this is a really easy case unless you want to reverse Wickard v. Filburn, which said in the Depression that a farmer couldn't even grow food on his own farm for his own consumption if it was above the limit without running afoul of the federal government. Or unless you want to reverse Mr. Scalia, he loves the founders. John Adams, who I believe was a founder, signed a bill in 1797 which said that seamen had to have hospitalization insurance and that their employers could dock their pay, i.e. an individual mandate, to pay for it. 1797, this is an easy case on the law. So I would like to have made that argument. Nobody can doubt that health care is very much an interstate commerce. And I kind of think they will uphold it, maybe by a narrow vote, but I sort of think they will because they already got Bush v. Gore on their scorecard. And I think those two cases, Bush v. Gore cases, were probably the worst cases in my lifetime, probably the worst cases since Korematsu, and maybe since the Lochner cases. So, and besides that, the mandate's not popular, so they may think they can hurt the president more by upholding it than by overturning it. That's what Carville thinks. I don't know if he's right or not. But anyway, once in a while I wish I had another job. Most of the time I'm just happy doing what I'm doing and grateful when the sun comes up in the morning and I can hit it again.
President Clinton, you are a force of nature. We are expecting from you great longevity, given what you've just told us. We want to remind you how important you are to us, how vital and singular your work continues to be, how valued and very much appreciated and beloved you are, not just from the people in this room, but people all around the world.
Well, my goal is to live long enough to be a grandfather. I'm doing my best to do that. And then when Hillary comes home, if she really does this, she'll be better at it than I ever was, like most everything else we ever did together, and I'm really looking forward to it. And thank you all. I hope you'll do this kind of work too. Thank you.
Thank you. President, thank you. Yeah.